This is Adam Shartoff. Hey, this is our first official recording here in the studio, right, Alex? Thank you. As producer Alex, we're now part of. I guess we can we say we're part of the Brazil network here, and there's a lot of great shows. We'll get more into that shortly, but for now, I just want to bring on my first guest here in the studio, which is Dave Itzkoff. He's a culture writer for the New York Times. He wrote the book Mad as Hell, subtitle, The Making of Network and the Fateful Vision of the Angriest Man in Movies. You're not referring to the character there, of Peter Finch's character. You're referring to, I'm assuming, the writer of the film, correct?
Yeah, we were having a little bit of fun there in the title, a little sort of pun for people who are familiar with the movie, because, of course, your first instinct might be to think of Howard Beale, who's the angry, mad prophet of the airwaves, played by Finch, but we're talking specifically about Paddy Chayefsky, who is the author of Network and its creative force and the man who dreamed it up and got it made. The
book, again, Mad as Hell, and I want to also add it's published by Picador, is available now in paperback, and it's in 2016 is enjoying its 40th anniversary, so we just want to get that out of the way. So it's all the more, I think, very appropriate that we're doing this segment, and I'm sorry I didn't get to it sooner. I wish I had.
That's okay. Thank you for finding it now. Any time is fine, as long as you liked it.
I did. I loved it, actually.
Great.
I really, the book is, even though you'd think it's just a kind of a making of type of approach to the movie, the classic Network, in fact, what I found and was a nice surprise is it's kind of about Chayefsky. That's kind of the focus of this book. The backdrop is the making of the film.
Yes, to understand... Yeah, absolutely. To understand Network, you have to understand Paddy Chayefsky. You have to understand not only his career and the trajectory that led him to the point where he wrote the movie, but also his way of thinking about the world and what he was so attuned to by the 1970s when he was in earnest writing the screenplay and doing the research for it, and why a person like this in particular would turn out the movie that he did, because his career is, for as much success as he enjoyed, by the time he wrote Network, he'd already won 2 Academy Awards, and the screenplay for Network would be his third. So a fairly powerful writer for his day and an acclaimed one, but also he was somebody who was very disenchanted with the world, had become very disenchanted with essentially every single medium that he had worked in to that point, which included theater, television, where he got his start, and movies, even as he continued to work in them, and was so sort of deeply afraid of, I think, so many developments that he saw in the nation and on a global scale. If all you know from the movie is the famous Mad as Hell speech that Peter Finch gives, I think you're still inclined to wonder, well, what would make somebody write a speech like that for a character like that? What did you have to sort of be thinking about at the time, and to if you think of the sort of litany of social ills that Finch kind of runs down in that speech, Chayefsky was, in a sense, worried about every single one of them, that all those things were things that he saw as potentially, devouring the country, making the world a worse place, and media itself being a kind of
conduit or something.
Exactly, a way to sort of disseminate all of these woes.
Yeah, he came out of television. You could say he came out of theater too, or what have you. But certainly, television was a central part of his early phase of his career. And he became a famous writer because of television. And then he was criticized after Network came out for himself criticizing television as a medium. But I think your point is actually that wasn't what he was trying to do. It was really saying something broader about society and about the commercialization and the corporatization of society. In that way, he was very prescient, of course. But it wasn't like he was a wholesale attacking television in particular.
No, that was certainly a huge aspect of the movie, but you're right that it was, to him, it was a sort of larger meditation on, alienation and, people feeling, ironically, sort of more and more isolated, even as media was moving faster and faster to connect them and make them aware of events happening in real time. Yeah. This is before, of course, the internet existed, before there was even really cable television to speak of. But yes, certainly it was received and interpreted as a large-scale attack on television, and Surprisingly, that caught Chayefsky off guard.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. Unless I'm mistaken, he refused to accept that the network was satirizing television, right? He just rejected that, didn't he?
It sort of depends on what day of the week you talk to him and what kind of mood he was in. I mean,
right.
he's look, he was a wonderfully sort of disgruntled, dyspeptic figure, and that made him a fantastic writer. And I'm sure in his heart of hearts somewhere, we can't know for certain, but my guess is that yes, I mean, he understood that part of what he was doing was biting the hand that once fed him. And if people don't know
right.
that his big breakthrough was writing a lot of the sort of early, golden age of television dramas, the sort of standalone dramas that would play on the anthology shows, and most famously Marty, which became the motion picture for which he also won the screenplay, wrote the screenplay and won his first Oscar. So there was, on the one hand, this feeling, to people who knew him, this sense of, well, how could you burn that bridge and turn your back on that medium? But also in the course of researching and writing Network, he had been able to spend time at the news operations of the three broadcast networks of the day, and he hung out with Walter Cronkite and John Chancellor.
Hired Cronkite's daughter.
Exactly.
Cast, right? Well, or I should say Sidney Lumet,
right.
was, and the casting director.
But right, certainly Chayefsky had a say in that as well. I mean, he got final say over everything in the film.
So glad you brought that up, actually, because Chayefsky had an unprecedented role, and I don't know if this existed before him. It must have, but that he had final say. Like, nobody could change a word or dialogue. In fact, it was Cronkite's daughter. Remind me of her first name.
Kathy Cronkite.
Kathy Cronkite, who plays a role in the film Network, loosely based on Patty Hearst, and which is a subplot going on in the film. And she approached Chayefsky very politely and charmingly about maybe changing a couple of words here and there so it would be more comfortable for her. And in a more generous moment, said, let's go with the dialogue I wrote. And, whereas I'm sure in other situations he would have been far less patient.
I think you're absolutely right. I think Kathy recognized, I mean, she was so green in her career at that point. Only somebody that sort of, earnest and naive could get away with an opportunity or a moment like that. But it existed because, Chayefsky had essentially, he'd sort of amassed his own, power and influence to that point to get himself into a situation where he could literally be on set every single day and not just sort of hanging around or waiting for somebody to ask him about the script, but that he had a special physical place, where they would film. He would be standing aside, just a couple of feet off from the camera underneath his own little light so that he could see what was going on. And that's where he watched every take of the film. And he wasn't necessarily watching to, he was not going to give notes to the actors on how they should adjust their performances. No,
he never crossed the line. He knew his place as far as, and Sidney Lumet's place, in fact. The two got along pretty well, didn't they?
Absolutely. And Lumet, knew what he was signing on for as well, and understood that if he was going to take this particular gig, that it would be, if not, a collaboration, then in some ways he was going to be, subordinate to Chayefsky. And if you recall, even the credits of the movie, you can go back and look at this. It doesn't, the first title comes up and it says Network, and it doesn't say screenplay by Patty Chayefsky. It says by Patty Chayefsky.
Yeah.
And, that's the kind of thing that now, if a director might get that kind of a credit because they would have that much influence over a film, but that's the level of control that he had and the degree to which this was really understood to be emanating from him. Even Lumet, for as much as he puts his fingerprints on the film and you really see his style and dynamic in it, and he's clearly exerting a lot of blood and toil, it's really Chayefsky's movie.
You're absolutely right. I don't even think there's been a case, with maybe the exception of Neil Simon, of anybody who's had their name above a film title. I'm sure, again, I'm not right, but I don't recall, and I have a pretty good, grasp. I mean, in terms of a writer of a screenplay having their name in the place of the director.
Yeah,
I think Neil Simon is maybe the only other exception, and his... argue what you will, but Patty Chayefsky certainly broke the mold.
Yeah, and it's also a funny thing that of course, Network came out in '76, and so sort of the if you believe in sort of the auteur,
Sorry, William Shakespeare. Excuse me. Continue. Go ahead.
Yeah, he never directed any films, though. Yeah.
But his name occasionally does get above the title. I just remembered. Just ignore what I was saying. I was showboating. This was a sort of this is the height of the auteur filmmaking movement, and really neither Chayefsky nor Lumet came out of that movement. They were both guys from the previous generation and were guys who had cut their teeth in live TV, and so the fact that they end up, both of them, being the sort of key contributors to this movie from that also is sort of part of that auteur era is sort of it's kind of accidental. We're talking to Dave Itzkoff. He's a culture writer for the New York Times. I'm not saying the culture writer because
there are others, many others.
There are many others, but you are somebody whose name has come up in my purview many times, actually. So it's a pleasure. And we're discussing his book, Mad as Hell. It's available now where books are sold or streamed. I don't know. There is I would imagine a Kindle copy or what have you, an ebook as well. And again, Network, which I just recently watched again. And I wanted to mention something about my having, because I remember this coming out when I was a very, 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 very little kid. But it was so much in the zeitgeist. I mean, there's no exaggeration to say that everybody referenced. It was like one of the catchphrases, we're going to need a bigger boat. On and on. I mean, through. Sure. But Mad as Hell, that was the sort of the most popular scene that that still resonates. But as we're watching, actually, there was another scene that to me is in fact the big. I think I don't know what you call it, maybe the apex or the
denouement.
And that's the scene with Ned Beatty.
Yeah. I'm glad you said that.
Yeah, I think really that, in a sense, is cumulatively most dramatic scene in the whole film.
Yeah, I know, and it's I don't know if it's funny or ironic that also another great speech, fantastically delivered and beautifully shot. It does get a little overshadowed in a sense by the Mad as Hell speech, which kind of occurs, right sort of dead center in the film, and that's a real sort of, you can easily divide the film into everything that happens before the Mad as Hell speech, everything that happens after. But yeah, no, Beatty, I mean, it gives just as memorable a delivery, and that's the speech where he is the head of the corporation that owns the network that Howard Beale is on, and as Beale is sort of, on the one hand, descending further into his madness, but also becoming ever more influential as a broadcaster, that is when Beatty's character sort of pulls him aside into his boardroom and says, look, you think that the world is nations? There are no nations. There are corporations, and there's only dollars and shekels and rubles, and it forever sort of changes Beale's way of looking at the world, and he becomes a kind of corrupted character after that. And it is extremely valid today, that speech, as much as the Mad as Hell speech. This idea that I mean, on a simple level, that corporations can have much more influence than nations, but also just the influence of I mean, not to sound like a wide-eyed conspiracy theorist, but the influence everywhere of corporate money and the influence of corporations being able to tell you what you can and can't say. That's certainly grown in the 40 years since this film came out.
The film, again, holds up. Entirely. Holds up entirely. If you haven't seen Network before, or if it's been a long time, I really urge everybody to go catch it again. And it stars, aside from Peter Finch, who we've already mentioned, and we've mentioned, I think we mentioned Ned Beatty, who is a very actually small role in it, but very important role. Faye Dunaway, of course, and William Holden and Robert Duvall. What a cast! Written by Patty Chayefsky, directed by Sidney Lumet. It's just an incredible team. Actually, even though another day player, Ned Beatty, by the way, was nominated for an Oscar for just a few moments on the screen, as was the actress
Beatrice Straight.
Thank you, Beatrice Straight, who was another came from the stage, and she actually won the Oscar.
That's right.
She played Holden's wife, and she was also only in for a few minutes, but had just an incredible performance. Just very moving and is very powerful. Peter Finch died after he was nominated, but before he was able to, before the awards
That's
right.
I mean, he basically died, in the course of promoting the film for its sort of award season. I mean, this is an era before there really was, the kind of full-scale, Oscar campaigning that we're used to now.
Oh, my God, right.
But it was, a network was a late, a year-end release. It came out, the widest national release was sort of November of '76, so Oscar nominations would have been right around the corner. And, the people like Faye Dunaway and Robert Duvall and even Bill Holden, I mean, they had moved on to other projects by the time it came time to, they were just working on other things. So the few people they could really tap to, sort of pound the drum in the press were Chayefsky himself, who, as we talked about, was sort of very dyspeptic and disgruntled and could go on the air and rant about.
You couldn't really guarantee what he was going to be like.
Right. So he may or may not have been the best
Caveat
guy.
emptor.
Exactly. Yeah. So that a lot of that burden also fell on Peter Finch. And he'd been out of the limelight for a really long time when this role came along. And, as he saw it sort of gaining steam, he'd been living in Jamaica and moved back to Beverly Hills to sort of, take advantage of this opportunity and kind of bask in all the goodwill that the role was generating. And yes, he died of a heart attack. He and Sidney Lumet were about to do a remote, appearance for one of the network morning shows, and he died in the hotel lobby.
Practically in Lumet's arms, right?
Yeah. Well, Lumet was one of the first people on the scene and tried to revive him. Yeah.
Yeah. Also, William Holden died not long after.
Yeah,
right?
within a couple of years after making the film. I mean, this was one of his last great roles as well, and he was also a nominee. And I mean, of course, he was not going to win out over Peter Finch, but I mean, certainly gives as stellar a performance in his own right.
The movie came out in 1976. It was ran up against just a couple of other relatively popular films. I think it shared a well, again, Beatrice Straight, of course, won for Best Supporting Actress. We already said Peter Finch won for Best Actor.
That's correct.
And there were Chayefsky won, of course, for Best Screenplay,
and Dunaway for Best Actress.
Oh, she that's right.
Yeah.
Goodness gracious! Split the awards though. I'd say the rest kind of went to either Rocky. Won
for Best Picture, and John Avildsen won for Best
Direction. Okay,
and I think that I mean, Rocky has a lot of merits as well, but I think that kind of sticks in people's craws to some degree. That this was as good a year as any for Lumet to have won Best Director. And, I mean, Rocky, God bless it, but, it is, it's become the sort of, if it wasn't already, the sort of archetypical, underdog sports film blueprint, whereas, Network maybe saying a few more complicated things and maybe teaching some lessons that have resonated a little bit longer.
So you didn't go for the Rocky. Well, now that you brought it up, actually, since I'm going to guess, I don't know. You were maybe not even alive 4 years ago. This was
the year of my birth, so that's why it has there's a lot of reasons why it resonates for me and why it's a special film for me. But I suspect that has some. Just anytime I hear the year 1976, it just kind of dings a bell for me.
Sure. Well,
so.
why wouldn't it? Same here.
Yeah.
Mine is just 77 or 78. I won't divulge. No, a little before actually. So something went ding. But what was the ultimate draw? You had a fascination with that period as well. 70s, of course, is holds a lot of resonance for film lovers.
Sure. I mean, it's all the things that you mentioned. Right. I mean, it's a movie set in New York. It's a sort of a rare, maybe the only sort of era of this kind of, polemical filmmaking where, this was a movie that was financed by two studios, by MGM and United Artists, that was basically, telling its audience how bad the mass media is. And for the big media corporations to basically be, funding that and giving it a platform to exist is astounding. That could never happen today. So all those things, but just Chayefsky as a personality, as a figure, is just irresistible. And I had this extraordinary opportunity because all of his papers are owned by the New York Public Library's Library for the Performing Arts, and they're accessible to anybody who wants to request them. So. They allowed me first for an article for the Times that I wrote, and then for the book, I just got to see as many of his papers as I could relating to the making of this film and to really the breadth of his career. And it's sort of an obvious thing to say, but again, it's an era before there was no digital technology to speak of. He didn't work on computer. Everything was either typewritten or handwritten. And because he was so fastidious and a little bit neurotic about fears of being sued, which he was eventually sued for his work, he just kept everything. And so you really can see, just by reading the papers, you can see the full trajectory of the film's creation, all the different iterations that it went through and all the ways that he thought about it because he was so disciplined about just committing everything to paper.
Mad as Hell. It's the name of the book. The author, Dave Itzkoff of the New York Times. Thank you very much.
It was my pleasure. Thanks a lot.
Really pleasure meeting you. Thanks a lot.